His billionaire father forced him to marry me, a beggar. But what he later learned shocked him. Welcome back with a new real shock story. Before we start, comment and tell me which city you're watching from. At the end, don't forget to subscribe and rate it from 0 to 10. Let's enjoy the story, everyone.
I never thought my life would turn upside down in just a few hours. I was sitting in my tiny, cluttered room, staring at the faded walls, trying to ignore the sound of the rain tapping against the window. It was one of those nights where everything feels heavy, and yet you're not even sure why. My father's voice had been in my head all day, echoing like a storm I couldn't escape. He had always been a strict man, one who expected the world from me, and I had always tried to meet his expectations, even when it left me feeling empty inside. But that evening, something felt different, like a shadow was creeping closer, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Earlier that morning, my life had seemed ordinary, maybe even boring. I had walked the same streets I had walked 1,000 times before, greeting familiar faces, nodding at neighbors, pretending everything was fine. I worked hard, studied late into the night, and always carried a sense of quiet pride in being responsible. But the calm was only a mask. Behind the polite smiles and careful steps, I had learned to hide the fear of my father's temper, the unspoken rules, the things I wasn't allowed to question. That day, I had returned from school, dropped my bag, and heard him call my name in a tone that froze me instantly. He never called me like that without reason. "You need to come with me," he said, his eyes sharp, calculating. There was no warmth, no hesitation, just authority, the kind that makes you obey without asking why. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask where we were going. I just followed, my heart thudding in my chest, the rain now soaking us both as we walked through the silent streets. Every instinct screamed that something was about to change, that nothing would ever be the same. When we arrived at the grand house, the one that always made me feel like a visitor in my own family, I froze. It wasn't too unusual for my father to have guests, but tonight there was a strange energy in the air, a tension I couldn't place. He led me into a room I had never entered before. The furniture was unfamiliar, the walls gleamed too brightly, and in the center, sitting with a calm I couldn't understand, was a girl. A beggar, my father said later, but at that moment, she looked like someone who had walked through a storm and survived, carrying a quiet strength I didn't yet understand. "Meet her," my father said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You are going to marry her." The words didn't make sense. I blinked, thinking I had misheard, that maybe my ears were playing tricks on me, but when I looked at him, I saw nothing but stern certainty. My mind raced. How could this be real? Why? I felt my chest tighten, my thoughts colliding with each other in a panic I couldn't control. My life, my plans, everything I thought I knew, was slipping through my fingers. The girl looked at me then, and for a moment I saw no fear, no hesitation, just eyes that had seen pain and hardship, eyes that seemed to understand the weight of the world. And suddenly, I felt a strange connection, a whisper of empathy, like she understood everything about me without a word being spoken. I wanted to ask questions, so many questions, but my father's presence was like a wall, unmovable and unyielding. I had no choice but to listen, to accept what he had decided for me, even though every fiber of my being screamed against it. We spent hours there, the three of us in that room, and the storm outside grew louder, mirroring the storm in my heart. My father explained his reasons, his logic twisted and cold. But to him, it was clear. To me, it was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The girl didn't say much. She only sat, calm, patient, and for some reason, that made it worse. How could someone be so composed in the face of such chaos? I couldn't understand it then, but later, I would realize that her strength was the thing that would challenge everything I had ever known. As the night deepened, I wandered through the grand hallways, feeling like a ghost in my own life. I touched the walls, tried to anchor myself to something real, but it was useless. Every step I took, every shadow I passed, whispered that nothing would ever be the same. I kept thinking about the girl, about her life, about what this marriage would mean for both of us. 1,000 emotions collided inside me. Fear, anger, confusion, curiosity, and something I couldn't name, a trembling anticipation of what might happen next. By the time I returned to my room, soaked from the rain and exhausted from the whirlwind of emotions, I realized one terrifying truth. My life had changed, not gradually, but violently, in a single evening. And as I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I knew that nothing, no plan, no dream, no hope, would ever be the same again. The question that haunted me, that kept me awake, that pulled me deeper into the unknown, was simple, yet impossible to answer. What would happen next, and could I survive it? The next morning, I woke to the sound of sunlight slipping through the heavy curtains, and for a brief moment, I almost forgot the nightmare from the night before. Almost. But the memory hit me like a wave, and I realized it wasn't a dream. It was real. My father's decision, the girl, the looming marriage, all of it was painfully, terrifyingly real. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands, trying to make sense of how my life had spiraled so suddenly into chaos. Every plan I had made, every quiet hope I had nurtured for myself, felt like it was crumbling into dust around me. I got up slowly, my mind still spinning, and decided I needed to understand who this girl really was. I had seen her the night before, calm, composed, unafraid, but I couldn't figure her out. How could someone so poor, someone my father deemed a beggar, carry themselves with such dignity? I wrapped myself in a shawl and made my way down to the kitchen, where she was already sitting quietly, sipping tea as if the world hadn't just dropped a storm on both of us. I froze for a moment, unsure how to even begin talking to her. Her eyes met mine, and in them, I saw something I didn't expect. No pity, no shame, only quiet strength. "Alec," she said softly, almost like she had known my name forever. "Don't be afraid. I'm not here to hurt you." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight I could feel in my chest. I wanted to speak, to ask why my father had done this, why he thought it was right to force our lives together, but no words came out. Instead, I only nodded, too stunned, too frightened, too confused to speak. Over the next few hours, I began to notice small things about her, how she carried herself, how her hands moved as she arranged the teacups, how she seemed entirely at ease in a house that was supposed to be foreign to her. And yet, every gesture hinted at a story, a past I could only guess at, a struggle she had survived that I could never imagine. My curiosity grew alongside a strange sense of empathy. I wanted to know her story, to understand how she had endured so much without breaking. And slowly, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just curious. I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if my father saw her strength, and realized that she might change everything he thought he controlled. That afternoon, my father called us both to the study. The way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes were sharp, impatient, demanding obedience. He didn't want us talking, connecting, or thinking for ourselves. He wanted us to follow his plan without question. But the girl remained calm. She didn't flinch. She didn't bow. She didn't cower. And in that moment, I realized I had never felt more helpless and more strangely inspired at the same time. Something about her presence challenged everything I had believed about fear and power. The days that followed were a blur of lessons, rules, and carefully monitored moments. My father treated her like an experiment, a living proof of his authority. And yet, every day, I watched as she quietly resisted, not with words, but with her very being. She held her head high, spoke only when necessary, and met every attempt to intimidate her with calm resilience. I found myself both in awe and in fear of her. I couldn't understand how someone could be so unshakable, yet I couldn't help but hope that maybe, just maybe, she would help me find the courage I had never known I lacked. One evening, as I sat alone in the library pretending to read, I overheard a conversation between my father and one of his associates. Words like control, lesson, and obedience floated through the air. He spoke as if our lives were puzzles for him to manipulate, as if the girl and I were pieces in some game we didn't understand. My heart raced. I realized that what my father had planned wasn't just about marriage. It was about power, about dominance, about proving that no one could challenge him. And the thought of it made my blood run cold. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling again, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. But this time, something else had stirred, a flicker of determination. Watching her, the girl, I began to understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was facing it, standing up even when the world tried to crush you. And if she could do it, maybe, just maybe, I could too. But I didn't know if that strength could survive what was coming. The next day, everything changed. My father announced that we would officially begin preparations for the wedding. The word itself sounded like a sentence. And yet, in the midst of fear, anger, and confusion, I felt something I couldn't quite name. I looked at her, and she looked back at me. A seal and understanding passing between us. Neither of us wanted this. Neither of us asked for it. But somehow, we would have to navigate the impossible. And deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the true storm, the part that would test every shred of our courage, was yet to come. The days turned into a blur, each one heavier than the last. My father's rules grew stricter, his expectations harsher, and the tension between us all seemed to thicken like the storm clouds that never seemed to leave our skies. I watched her move through the house, always poised, never faltering, even when my father's eyes cut into her like knives. And every time I looked at her, I felt that mix of fear and admiration again. How could someone so small carry such strength? And yet, the more I watched, the more I realized she wasn't just surviving. She was quietly, dangerously changing the rules of the house. It started with small things. She refused to take the seat my father had assigned her in the dining room, sitting instead where she pleased, without asking permission. She spoke softly but firmly, correcting the servants when they hesitated, and when my father questioned her, she didn't stumble or flinch. I could see my father's patience cracking, the cold mask of control starting to slip. I had never seen him like this, and it terrified me. I knew if I said or did the wrong thing, I would be next to feel his wrath. But I couldn't look away. One evening, the tension snapped. I was in the study, pretending to organize papers, when I heard raised voices. My father's tone was sharp, demanding obedience, but hers was calm, deliberate, almost haunting. "I will not follow orders that humiliate me," she said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the air like a knife. I froze, my heart hammering. No one had ever spoken to my father like that. Not my mother, not me, not anyone.
Jan, and in that moment, I realized something terrifying. She wasn't afraid, and worse, he was. The confrontation escalated quickly.
My father slammed his hand on the table, shouting, "Do you think you can defy me?" But she didn't retreat. She met his anger with silence, letting him exhaust himself in fury. I watched, unable to move, feeling a strange mixture of panic and hope. Panic because I didn't know what would happen next, and hope because I had never seen courage like this in my life. Every fiber of my being wanted to intervene, to beg her to stay quiet. But something inside me stirred, a quiet spark, telling me that maybe it was time to stop being invisible. Over the next few days, the house became a battlefield of unspoken power. My father tried everything: threats, intimidation, even subtle manipulation. But she remained untouchable. And slowly, I began to see cracks in my father's armor. The servants whispered about her bravery, and I overheard my father arguing with his associates, frustrated that his plan wasn't working. It was as if her very presence was challenging the world he had built so meticulously. And I was trapped in the middle, terrified that either she or I, or both of us, would pay the price. I started to notice how much her strength affected me. I was learning from her, without even trying. I began to speak up in small ways, testing boundaries, questioning minor rules that used to scare me. Each time I did, I felt a rush of fear and exhilaration. It was dangerous, yes, but I was alive in a way I hadn't been before. And the more I resisted silently, the more I realized that my father's control was not absolute. Then came the night that changed everything. I was in the library, organizing books that no one read, when I heard muffled sounds coming from the corridor. I crept closer and peeked around the corner. My father was confronting her again, but this time, it wasn't just a verbal argument. He grabbed her arm, trying to force her to obey. She didn't scream or struggle violently. She simply held her ground. Her eyes locked on his with unshakable resolve. I could see him faltering, his confidence wavering in a way I had never witnessed. I wanted to step in, to protect her, but my legs felt like stone. And then, in a moment that felt like the world had stopped, she spoke. "You may control the house, but you do not control me," she said. The words were quiet, but they echoed in the hall like thunder. My father froze, his grip loosening, his face pale. I didn't understand then what it meant, but I would come to realize that this was the first crack in the armor of the man who had ruled our lives for so long. That night, as I lay awake, I felt both hope and terror. Hope because maybe we could survive this, and terror because I knew the storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. The tension didn't ease in the days that followed. Every glance, every step, every word became a test of strength. I watched her navigate the house like a chess master, predicting my father's moves and silently outmaneuvering him. And all the while, I felt myself changing. I was no longer just a silent observer of fear. I was learning, growing, discovering courage I didn't know I had. But the deeper I went into this battle, the more I realized the danger was real. One wrong move, one slip of emotion, and everything could collapse. By the end of that week, the entire house felt like a powder keg. Every room, every hallway, every glance carried tension so thick it was almost visible. My father was no longer fully in control, and she had begun to influence not just me, but everyone around us. And yet, despite all this power she wielded without even raising her voice, the real challenge was yet to come. I could feel it in my bones. The moment where the stakes would rise so high, the consequences would be unbearable, and we would have to face the truth of what our lives had become.
That night, the house felt alive in a way I had never experienced before, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something inevitable.
I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing the storm raging outside. I had never been more aware of every sound, every shadow, every glance. My father's anger had grown unbearable, and the quiet strength of the girl, her presence, had shifted something fundamental in the balance of power. I didn't know what would happen, but I knew, with terrifying certainty, that nothing could ever go back to the way it was. I was in the hallway, trying to steady myself, when I heard my father's footsteps approaching. Heavy, deliberate, unstoppable. The girl was standing at the end of the hall, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. And then it happened. He shouted, his voice breaking like thunder, demanding obedience, expecting fear, expecting submission. But she didn't flinch. She met his fury with a calm that made the air vibrate with tension. I could feel it, the intensity radiating from them, like a storm contained in one room. I wanted to run, to hide, but my feet refused to move. I was frozen, watching history unfold in front of me. "You will do as I say!" My father yelled, his face red, veins bulging. His power, his authority, everything he had relied on to control the world around him, was cracking. And then she said something that made the air itself seem to shift. "No, I will not. I refuse to live a life defined by fear or control." The words were quiet, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I felt my chest tighten, my breath catch, and yet, for the first time, I felt hope stirring in the pit of my fear. The confrontation escalated into a physical struggle. My father grabbed her arm, trying to assert the dominance that had always been unquestioned. She didn't resist violently, but her presence, her strength, her refusal to yield made him stumble, falter, doubt. I had never seen him like this, stripped of certainty, exposed, vulnerable in a way that made him most frightening. I wanted to intervene, but I realized she didn't need me to. She was standing her ground in a way that demanded recognition, not just from him, but from me, from the world. The seconds stretched, each one unbearably long, each one loaded with the weight of consequences. I could feel the fear in my stomach, the adrenaline in my veins. This was it. The moment where everything could change, where the carefully constructed life my father had built could collapse in an instant. And then, something unexpected happened. He released her arm, not because he had won, but because he realized she could not be controlled, not by force, not by fear. The revelation hit me like lightning. Sometimes, power is not what you take. It is what you cannot destroy. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the intensity of what had just occurred. My chest heaved with fear, relief, and awe. The girl looked at me then, her eyes softening, acknowledging the storm we had just survived. And for the first time, I understood that courage could be contagious. I had felt powerless, trapped in a life that seemed dictated by another's whims, but witnessing her strength ignited something inside me, a fire that had been dormant, waiting for this exact moment to awaken. The night didn't end there. My father retreated to his study, slamming the door behind him, muttering threats I could barely hear. And yet, the air felt lighter, charged with a strange electricity, a sense that the rules had shifted. The girl didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. She simply moved with quiet confidence, and in her presence, I began to believe that we could survive whatever came next. As I lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, I replayed every second of the confrontation in my mind. Fear, anger, relief, hope, all tangled together in a storm I could barely comprehend. I realized that life as I had known it was over. It would be no return to the safety of routine or obedience. Every choice I had ignored, every thought I had suppressed, now demanded attention. And I knew one terrifying truth. The real challenges were only beginning. The house was silent then, but the tension lingered, a quiet reminder that this night had changed everything. I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, knowing that the girl's strength had not only challenged my father, but had also awakened something in me. I didn't yet know how, or when, or in what ways, but I could feel the shift deep inside, a shift that promised both danger and freedom, both struggle and possibility. And in that moment, as the storm outside began to ease and the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains, I asked myself a question that I knew would haunt me for the days to come. Could we survive what was coming next, or was this just the beginning of an even greater storm? The morning after that night felt almost unreal. The house was quiet, but the weight of what had happened lingered in every corner, in every shadow. I walked through the halls slowly, noticing things I hadn't before. The way the sunlight hit the polished floors, the faint scent of flowers the girl had placed in the living room, the subtle shift in my father's demeanor. He was quieter, tense, calculating, and I knew that the power he had always wielded so effortlessly had been shaken. And yet, despite the small sense of relief, I couldn't fully relax. The storm had passed, but the clouds of uncertainty still hovered over us. I found the girl in the garden, sitting on a bench with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the dew on the grass. I walked over cautiously, unsure of what to say. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. She looked up at me, her eyes calm, but there was a depth there, a quiet knowing that seemed beyond my years. "I will survive," she said simply, "and so will you." Her words weren't boastful or cruel. They were almost gentle, but they carried the weight of experience, the kind of understanding that comes only from facing unimaginable challenges and refusing to break. We spent the next few days adjusting to the new reality in silence, learning to navigate the tension that still hung between us and my father. His anger was subdued, more dangerous in its quiet, and I could feel the strain it placed on everyone in the house. The girl moved through it with grace, never forcing attention, never demanding recognition, but her presence alone was enough to remind everyone that fear could no longer dictate our lives. I found myself studying her, learning from her, realizing that courage wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, deliberate, unwavering. And then, in a moment I didn't expect, I began to understand the larger lesson in all of this. My father had believed that control and fear could bend our wills, but the truth was far more complicated. Strength didn't come from wealth, from authority, or from threats. It came from within. It came from refusing to be broken, even when the world tried its hardest to crush you. I realized that his attempts to control us had only revealed the resilience we didn't know we had. The days turned into weeks, and the house began to change in subtle ways. The servants moved with less hesitation. The atmosphere shifted from oppressive to cautious respect, and I noticed a quiet transformation within myself. I no longer felt like a shadow, a silent observer of my own life. I had begun to speak, to assert small decisions, to feel the power of choice again. And I knew, deep down, that this change wasn't just for me. It was for the girl too, for the invisible threads that connected us, for the future we could shape together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with fiery colors, I sat with her in the garden once more. "Do you think he will ever understand?" I asked softly. She looked at me, her gaze steady and unwavering, and I realized that understanding wasn't the point. "He doesn't have to," she replied. "What matters is that we understand ourselves, that we know our worth, our strength, and that we refuse to be controlled by fear or anger. That is the lesson that he cannot take from us." Her words sank into me, leaving a strange combination of calm and resolve. I began to see the story not just as a personal struggle, but as part of a larger reality. A world where control, injustice, and fear often try to dictate lives, and where courage, resilience, and inner strength are the only shields against it. I understood that our experiences, though painful and frightening, had the power to teach, to inspire, and to challenge the assumptions of those who believe they are untouchable. As night fell, I thought about the journey we had endured, the fear, the confrontation, the lessons learned, and the strength that had emerged. I realized that life would continue to throw challenges our way, but the courage we had discovered in each other and within ourselves would remain. It was a quiet, unshakable truth. No one could take away the power of resilience, the strength of spirit, or the choice to face fear with courage. And in that quiet moment, I asked myself a question I knew would linger long after the story ended. How many people go through life trapped by fear, by expectation, by control, never realizing the power they carry within themselves? How many lives could change if only someone dared to stand, quietly but firmly, and refuse to be broken? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I had seen it, I had lived it, and I would never forget it. The days after that night felt different, like the air itself had shifted. My father was quieter now, less certain, less commanding, and the house no longer felt like a cage. I could move, speak, and even think in ways I hadn't dared before. But the change wasn't just in him, it was in me. I had survived fear. I had watched courage unfold in front of me, and I had begun to carry it within myself. Each moment, each breath, was no longer weighed down by dread. It was lighter, yet sharper, as if I was seeing the world in color for the first time. I often found myself sitting with her in the garden, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking softly about the life we might build, the lessons we had learned, the strength we hadn't known we possessed. She never boasted about her courage, never claimed victory. She simply existed, calm and resilient, a quiet force that changed everything by refusing to bend. I realized then that real power doesn't need to scream. It simply is. And those who try to control it through fear will always be the ones who falter first. Life began to move slowly toward a new rhythm. My father, though still present and still demanding in small ways, had lost the absolute control he had relied on. And I, too, had learned that obedience and fear were not the same as respect or love. I could speak, make choices, and even challenge his decisions in small ways, something I had never dared before.
But the most important change was inside me. My fear had lost its grip, and with it, a new sense of confidence had taken root. And then, one evening, as I watched the sun sink behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, I understood the full scope of what had happened. This wasn't just a story about a father and a girl, about obedience and rebellion, about power and resistance. It was about the invisible strength that exists inside all of us, waiting to be discovered in moments we think we can't survive. It was about courage, the kind that grows quietly, deliberately, and persists even when the world tries to crush it. I thought about the people around me, the friends, the neighbors, the countless lives that never see this kind of strength, that never get the chance to confront the fear and control imposed upon them. I realized that the story we had lived, the storm we had survived, wasn't ours alone. It belonged to anyone who had ever been forced into silence, anyone who had ever felt powerless, anyone who had been told they had to obey. And that realization filled me with a strange, almost overwhelming sense of responsibility to carry that story, to live it, to let it teach others that fear is temporary, but courage is eternal. In the quiet of the night, I asked myself the question that had haunted me since the very beginning. How many people go through life trapped by fear, by expectation, by control, never realizing the power they carry within themselves? And the answer, finally, became clear. Too many. But now, I knew that even one act of bravery, even one refusal to be broken, could ripple outward, touching lives in ways we cannot always see. I had lived it. I had felt it. And I knew that I would never allow anyone or anything to take that away. As I lay down that night, the moonlight streaming through my window, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. The storm had passed, but the lessons remained. I had faced fear, I had witnessed courage, and I had learned that strength doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers, quietly and insistently, in the hearts of those who dare to listen. And for the first time in my life, I felt fully awake, fully alive, and fully capable of facing whatever came next. Because I had survived. Because I had seen courage in its purest form. And because I finally understood that the story doesn't end with fear. It begins with the moment we refuse to be broken.